This is the first event we're having in 2024. So welcome. So thank you all for coming and coming out to support Hope. Justa Hope is the author of more than 20 romances for Berkley, Harlequin, and Macmillan. She's been featured in numerous entertainment media outlets, including NBC's Today Show, Time Out New York, and the New York Post. She's the co-founder of the popular Manhattan-based Lady Jane Salon reading series. Irish Eyes, set in Gilded Age and Jazz Age New York City, is Hope's historical fiction debut and the launch of her American Songbook series. Prior to embarking on her writing career, she earned a master's degree in psychology and a PhD in education, both from the Catholic University of America. She lives in Manhattan with her husband and their supremely spoiled rescue cats. Can relate. And tonight she's in conversation with Fiona Davis, who is the New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction set in the iconic New York City buildings, including The Spectacular, which came out this June, The Magnolia Palace, which was a Book of the Month pick, and The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. She lives in New York City and is a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School. So thank you all for coming. Now I'm going to turn it over to Hope and Fiona.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you everybody for coming out on this night.
So I think all things considered, we're doing really well. And again, thank you so much for coming out on a chilly, complicated January night to celebrate with me.
And it has been. It's been a long road for this book, and so I'm very excited to share that have you share that process. And so Hope and I met Hope about 10 years ago when I had not written a thing, and I thought maybe I'd try and write a book. And I learned that there was this writer's place downtown called Lady Jane's where people would go and read from their books. And I thought, I should find a community. And I went down there, and it was a cold night, and I walked in and up the stairs, and I was so nervous because, I don't know anyone, and Hope was the first person who greeted me. And she was so warm and get all teary. She was so warm and welcoming, and it was just such a wonderful environment, and I know there's a lot of people here who were there at a really special time. So thank you for everything you've done for the writing community.
That's lovely, thank you.
And this book is just amazing. I have to tell you, I have to read just someone who gave it a really lovely blurb, and she said, "Well done to Hope Tarr for a magical journey, so grueling, so full of optimistic belief in the hope of a better future. I loved Rose and how she fought for her own strength within herself. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York." It doesn't get better than that. And so just started off, you wrote romance for a very long time.
Long time, yeah. I did about 25 books for multiple publishers. I started out working for, writing for Berkley, and then it was Harlequin, and I did a bunch of books for them, and then some smaller presses, and yeah, it's been a long road, and I always wanted to do something with an Irish protagonist, but when I was writing romance, and Barb, you will appreciate this, I came up with idea after idea for romance fiction set in Ireland. My editor would listen very patiently, and she'd go, "Oh, good, I like it, yeah, oh, it's good. There's just one thing. Oh, what is that? Can you move it to the Scottish Highlands?" The Scottish Highlands sells, right? And I love the Scottish Highlands, but I never got to write my Irish romance novel, so maybe that was a good thing. I then channeled it.
And so how did this come about? What made you want to do historical fiction, first of all, and then what was the inspiration for Irish Eyes?
Well, the short answer for historical fiction is I read your books. Absolutely amazing. Fiona's first book, set in the Barbizon Hotel, was just brilliant. I've always loved historical fiction. I grew up reading Anya Seton and Philip Bakar, which is sort of Gothic, but always historically set. And I really was starting to feel that as I evolved as a writer, I had stories to tell that didn't fit as neatly into a genre fiction format. I'm also part Irish myself, not as Irish as I could aspire to be, but I wanted to do something with an Irish protagonist, but I didn't really have a story in mind. And then in 2008, I was in Western Ireland on a hiking trip, and it was raining even for Ireland. And so instead of doing the walk we had planned, they piled us onto a bus and took us to that, the tick off the box tourist stop, the Cliffs of Moher. And I was standing there, I almost didn't walk up because it was so slippery and nasty and misty. And I looked out across and the mist parted and I saw a trio of islands that I learned was the Aran Islands. And then suddenly Rose O'Neill, my heroine's story, started to take shape in my mind. And then when I came back to New York, I would be running and I would run Battery Park, and I would look across and I would see Ellis Island, and I would see obviously the Statue of Liberty, and I would think about all of the sort of the whispers of the stories of immigrants, not just from Ireland, but from all over the world who've come through that gateway. And the story started to take shape in my mind in a major way.
And so that was around 2008.
And
That
15
it
years
began.
later, here we are.
I love the way in this book she incorporates real life events from New York history, like the 1899 blizzard, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the Windsor Hotel fire, and they're all incorporated in this book that spans, I think, 24 years. Is that right?
Exactly, yes.
And so what kind of research did you do? How did you manage to do this? Because you tell a beautiful story over a long period of time, but you make it flow so beautifully.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, especially coming from you. I mean, you have such a journalism background, and the way you incorporate that into your books is so interesting. For me, I'm a history geek. When I first moved to New York in 2008, my lovely friend Leanna Renee Heber, another author of the many authors here tonight, who had had some stints working as a tour guide. And I remember Leanna took me all around New York one day. We had just a one-on-one kind of a girls' day, and pointed out things that I walked past all the time and never really registered. Like, oh, we're in Gramercy Park. Do you know that these twin lampposts mean that this was a mayoral residence? No, I didn't know that. And so she would point out, one, sort of interesting thing after another. And I realized, as I would then take my own walks, that, history is all around us. Living history is all around us if you know where to look and you know where to listen to the whispers. And so that was a big part of it. And I was lucky enough to be living in New York, in Manhattan. And then also I'm a big believer in primary sources. So, I mean, anything, that's archived on newspapers.com, journals, diaries. For Irish Eyes, I found a lovely gem of a museum, the New York Fire Museum on Spring Street, which, it's one of those wonderful museums you can actually go through thoroughly in 2.5 or 3 hours. I knew by then I wanted one of my main characters to be a fireman. Firemen were the heroes of the day, the swashbuckling figures that young girls would sort of tremble and simper as they went past. And also it was a real, the fire department was a real portal for getting into politics, municipal politics. And so I knew I wanted this fireman hero or anti-hero at some point. And so I went to the museum and started just doing a ton of research, and then connected with some retired firemen who patiently, God bless them, answered all of my questions, and even in one case read some of my pages.
Have you seen the memorial for the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the new one?
It's amazing.
It's incredible.
Amazing. I mean, they had been talking about it for years. When I remember going in 2011 to the 100th year anniversary, the centennial, and being so moved. And that building and that whole site is, to me, it's always been a memorial. I mean, it's lovely now to actually have those names presented in something other than chalk.
Yeah, if you get a chance, go see it for sure. We won't say anything about it because I don't want to ruin the beauty of it and the simplicity of it. But it's amazing. What is the cross streets?
It's green, and it's adjacent to
Right off the park.
Washington Square Park. In fact, the fire we're referencing is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. And Washington Square Park, which is adjacent to what is now the Brown Building, was the Ash Building, oddly enough, back in the day. And so people, when they heard the sirens and they saw the plume of smoke, not just media, but families who had loved ones working in the building, they all just crowded and they were cordoned off in that park, and they literally stood and watched, in many cases, these young women and girls leaping from the windows to escape the flames. And at first, when these sightings happened, they thought that they were mannequins. They didn't realize that they were actual people. I get goosebumps talking about it. So.
And it's beautifully incorporated into the book.
Thank you.
And then let's talk about the love triangle. We have Rose, we have Adam, and we have Joe. And these are both men who are very different, completely different backgrounds. And I'm curious to know how you developed them, where they came from. Did you have a preference for one over the other? And tell us a little about them.
Sure. So I have two heroes, or one hero and one anti-hero, depending on your perspective and where you are in the book. The Adam character rather, came to me first. Adam, for those of you who haven't quite delved into the book yet, is very different to Joe. He's blue-blooded. His family is one of Mrs. Astor's 400, and he joins up. He volunteers to fight in the Spanish-American War in 1898 in order to. I mean, he's young and idealistic, but he really wants to get away from his family and the constraints of being pigeonholed in this, corporate, robber baron sort of situation. And then Joe is completely different. First generation Irish American, Lower East Side upbringing. Starts out life as a boxer, and you don't get more. Literally a bare-knuckled boxer. He was a bare-knuckle boxer, and then transitions to firefighting. But I think some of the touchstones that connect them, they're both very influenced by their families. Joe has an older sister who kind of raised him, so she's a surrogate mom, and she really pushes him to get into politics when it's maybe not clear if that's the best plan for him. And so she's very ambitious, and obviously Adam's family is very ambitious for him. And both of these men are sort of tangling with families, struggling with the very codified role of not just women in that society, but men. Making a marriage to satisfy a whole community of people rather than yourself. So, I think everybody in that kind of situation loses a little and has challenges. Obviously my focus was on Rose, but I did feel for them.
And you can see why she's attracted to them.
Yes.
They both have both good and dark sides.
Yeah. Now I will admit, to answer the latter part of your question, I am Team Adam. Team Adam. Although I have to say, there were points in the book where Joe, as I was writing, made me a little weak-kneed. He certainly has his moments. And sometimes when I would get frustrated with Adam, I would go back to writing more about Joe. So it's sort of like, and it occurs to me in retrospect in the book, which is a long book, when Adam is at his worst, Joe is at his best. And then as that sort of starts to shift and Adam starts to come more into his own, then Joe sort of goes off the track there. But so I had a lot of fun. And what a great problem to have, two interesting, sexy men to choose from.
And one of the fun things you do is you have a lot of historical figures, real people, wander in and out, and that's tricky because how much do we know about them? How much do we have to be exactly true to what they were, what they said? And you do it quite well. Can you tell a little bit about some of the figures that you chose and why? And then how did you do it? What was your process in terms of weaving them into the story?
Yeah, it was, I tried to think about not just the historical characters I chose, but also the sort of the news events, like the triangle that I chose to put in the book. I tried to really always bring it back to Rose and her family and their direct experience. So what would have really impacted them most? Certainly the Triangle Fire, where you have family members in the building. In terms of the characters, Joe in the book becomes a politician through the backing of Tammany Hall, the Democratic municipal political machine in New York City, for many, many years, putting forth the careers in the case of Irish immigrants, but then also in later years branching off to immigrants from Eastern Europe and other areas. And so one of the things that's so great and makes it a little easy to do that, the Tammany Hall men loved to talk, and they loved to be quoted in the press. And so I always feel that I'm never doing anyone a disservice if I use their own words. There was one Tammany Hall politician who said, greed and graft is fine as long as it's honest greed and graft. As like, how do you make that distinction? And so, people like Tom Foley, people, who were, we all know Charlie Murphy, took over Tammany for, I think it was the longest running head boss. But you see these there's still a Foley Square in New York. I mean, you see these names peppering buildings and park plaques, and they're all around us. And so I think it's so interesting to know where they came from. And like most things in life, no institution is entirely good or entirely evil. I mean, Tammany Hall did terrible things. I mean, they hired toughs to rough up people and coerce them to vote a certain way. They stuffed ballot boxes. They had what they called repeaters, people that men that they paid to vote, more than once. They would go from different districts with faked credentials and vote, many times. Horrible. I mean, and blatantly so. I mean, there was no subterfuge. At the same time, I mean, if you didn't have the rent money, or your husband was hurt on the job and couldn't work, they were there for you. And so they cultivated this kind of complicated loyalty that is very interesting, and very interesting even in the context of today, I think.
And another thing about what I love about Rose is she goes through so much, and you really live with her as she lives through the time period. And World War I especially really affects her, as it affected a number of women who were waiting for their men to come home and had to, take up the slack in the meantime. And so can you talk a little bit about how that launched Rose and what her reaction was to the Great War?
Yeah, I mean, for Rose, she is, somewhat mature at the time. For the time World War I rolls around in the book, she's in, I think her 30s, and she has young adult, teenage children, and her son, Joey, signs up. I actually found out in my research that if you had a parental waiver in World War I, or the Great War as it was then called, you could sign up at 16 years old if your father, the head of the household, signed off. Crazy. We know about other wars where women have stowed away as soldiers, or young people have, but this was, you could legally sign up. And so she's very invested in the war going well. She sells, a ton of Liberty bonds. She, really stumps for the cause. And, at the same time, it's very complicated because she still has relatives in Ireland who are not so keen to fight, for the Allies, for the British in World War I. So, I mean, we tend to think that complicated times are just the purview of the here and now. But I mean, I think it's always been complicated times. But one of the things I had a lot of fun with is sort of seeing Rose in conflict with her daughter, her teenage daughter Moira, who's a suffragist and sees things very differently than her mom, as mothers and daughters, not always, but sometimes do. And really sort of, it was a way in to understand, or to better understand, how World War I, as awful as all wars are, was really an entryway for American and British women to, enter the job market, to take over jobs that young men, had to relinquish to go and fight on the front lines. It was a way to get real political cred in the fight for the vote for women. Not just fighting for what became known as the 19th Amendment, but also, we forget that the individual states also were, adding, in some cases, amendments to their constitution. So New York State actually allowed women to vote in state elections long before several years before the 19th Amendment ever passed. So it's really, really interesting. And then to see how all of these factions of, I don't think they really would have labeled themselves feminists, but suffragists worked together, sometimes worked at odds, different styles. We all know about Alice Paul and her Sentinels of Liberty picketing the White House.
It's funny, I realize I don't know the answer to this question. When did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
Such a good question. I always knew I was a writer. I think, I had sad stints as an attempted ballerina, and I remember trying to sing Marie Osmond's Paper Roses with a warbling voice. But I always really knew I wanted to be a writer. It's the only kind of creative pursuit that ever really clicked with me, and that I always was sort of, I knew I was good at it, and so that drove me to want to be better at it, and it still drives me to want to be better at it. And I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, we're going to maybe take a little segue here. I would love to know what you're working on now. You have 7 books under your belt, right? 7 so far. All of Fiona's books are anchored to an iconic New York building, whether it's Grand Central or obviously the New York Public Library was the GMA book club pick. But I would like to hear a little bit about what you're working on now, and I'm sure we all would too.
You're so kind. Yeah, the next book is set at the Met Museum.
Yay!
Oh, good. Yes, that's a good reaction. And it takes place partly in the 1930s and partly in 1978 from 2 points of view. One is an assistant curator who is trying to track down a missing artifact, and she has to team up with an assistant to the Met Gala. So it's 2 very different sides of the Met who have to team up to try and solve this mystery, and it's been very fun.
That sounds delicious. Well, the Met Gala, you have me.
And just a quick note, also in March, that won't be out until a year, so January 2025. But Greg and I, my boyfriend, we've written, he's also a writer, and we wrote an audiobook novella that comes out in March called The Gimlet Slip, and it takes place in Prohibition era New York, and it should be really fun, so keep an eye out for that too.
Awesome.
But I think we have a little more time. I just want to ask, who would you cast in the film roles?
So this is like one of my favorite writer questions. I always saw Benedict Cumberbatch as Adam. I think Mr. Cumberbatch may have aged out a little bit. I hate to say that because that means maybe I've aged out a little bit. It's funny how those go together. Someone Benedict Cumberbatch-like would be great. I am very fond of Adam, and I would have to be an actor who could make that transition from sort of an idealistic, writerly, sort of shy young man to somebody who becomes a man who understands how New York City works, how things work, and how to make it work for himself. For Joe, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, hands down. I don't care that he too is probably aged out. I don't care. I'm going to give him a hall pass. Somebody who can be vulnerable and gritty and charming in the same moment.
And they can do CGI now. You can make anyone look any age.
It's solved. It's solved. And then for Rose, I've actually had this actress on my vision board for a couple years now, Eleanor Tomlinson from Poldark. Most of us know her from Poldark. Just so luminous, and I followed her career. I would love to see her in a big feature film, like Irish Eyes. I think she would be really, really fabulous.
And what are you working on now? And can you tell us a little about the American Songbook series?
Yes, I would love to. So I get many of my ideas running, and I was well into working on Irish Eyes, and I knew that I wasn't going to be happy saying adieu to Rose and the Kavanaugh Blakeleys with one book. And so I was running, it was a very hot day here in New York, pre-pandemic, and suddenly it just came to me like, no, this has to be a trilogy. It has to be called the American Songbook series. And literally, I stopped running. I had my phone with me. I pulled out like my notes app and just started typing. These are the titles. The titles have to be this. And literally, not to be too woo-woo, I felt like it was almost a divine directive. And when I get that kind of clear directive, I listen. And so I fought for it. So Irish Eyes, obviously, it covers, as Fiona said, 24 years in turn of the century and early 20th century New York City history. The second book, which I'm working on now, Stardust, will follow Rose's granddaughter, Daisy, in New York and in Paris during the occupation in the Second World War. So that will be, it's a lot of fun. It has different challenges. It will be cover more like 5 or 6 years versus 24, but it's a very tight time period. Basically, Daisy goes to Paris to apprentice with Coco Chanel and ends up being drawn into this fascinating and dangerous web of people who congregate at the Ritz Hotel, which was literally right across Rue Cambon from Maison Chanel. So you have, it's crazy, you have Nazis, once the occupation starts, you have German spies, you have Free French spies working for Charles de Gaulle's Free French. You've got resistance fighters. You've got bored expat American and British socialites. And you've got the creme de la creme of Paris society, and they're all drinking together in the same bar, the same tiny little bar in the Hotel Ritz for 4 years, well 5 years. I don't think there was much drinking done the last year there were, but 4 years, and they're all rubbing. You've got journalists like Martha Gellhorn, and they're all just knocking back these drinks, socializing, and then in the interim, figuring out how to slip a dagger in each other's back. So a lot of fun.
That is the perfect setting for a book.
Yes, lots of cocktails. And then the third book is a little fuzzy. That will be Dream a Little Dream, based on the song Dream a Little Dream of Me. And that will take the Kavanaugh Blankley clan into the 40s and 50s in Hollywood. So when F. Scott Fitzgerald and Dorothy Parker are trying to reinvent themselves as screenwriters, into the McCarthy era, which Fiona knows all about because of the Chelsea Girls. There's a lot of tumult and terror. So
These sound, you have to write faster. You have to go home and write. It sounds amazing.
looks like
Everyone for those questions. We're gonna take a brief pause and just pivot to the starting part. So just stay seated, and I will call you when we're ready.
All right.